Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. At the Dana White's Contender Series post-fight scrum, Dana White made some comments directed at Pat Miletich regarding some conspiracies at UFC 279, saying the UFC purposely shifted around the card, blah, blah, blah. And an MMA media member corrected him and said, no, that was Brendan Schaub. And Dana White said, oh, well, that makes sense. We're going to play the clips here in a minute. But I wanted to make a video kind of breaking down everything that happened because, first off, this MMA media member was partially wrong. And then Dana had kind of already went off about Pat Miletich. But then the headline today was about Dana White going off about Brendan Schaub. And then Brendan Schaub took to Instagram and posted this long statement, which was absolutely hilarious. But, you know, even though it was very, very funny because of some, you know, hypocritical things he said in there was also some truths to what Brendan Schaub posted, and we're going to read that, break that down line by line. I'm going to play the clip of Dana White. I'm going to play the clip of Pat Miletich. I'm going to show you guys the message that Brendan Schaub posted, and then also I'm going to give you my final thoughts on the whole UFC 279 weigh-in conspiracy, press conference conspiracy. Is there a real chance that the UFC, you know, conspired together with all 6 of these fighters to shift around the card on 24 hours notice and sell pay-per-views? Because that's what people are speculating. I'm going to get to that towards the end of the video. So first off, for those of you who have maybe been living under a rock, the entire top 3 fights of UFC 279 got shifted around. Main event was supposed to be Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz. Co-main event was supposed to be Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang. And the featured fight on the card was supposed to be Kevin Holland versus Daniel Rodriguez. Khamzat Chimaev came in overweight. Nate Diaz said, I'm not fighting him. So what the UFC did is they moved Tony Ferguson up to the main event. We got Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson. They took Kevin Holland out of his fight with Daniel Rodriguez and matched him up with Khamzat Chimaev because Daniel Rodriguez and Kevin Holland were supposed to fight at a catch weight of 180 pounds because it was a short notice fight. They moved Kevin Holland up. He fought Khamzat Chimaev in the co-main event. And then they took the remaining 2 fighters in Daniel Rodriguez and Li Jingliang and matched them up against each other. So all 3 fights got shifted around, and there's been, you know, talk that the UFC planned to do this because of lackluster pay-per-view buys, this and that. And, you know, you also had the canceled, you know, pre-fight presser the day before, and this all happened kind of, you know, super quickly. So people are just very speculative. And the move was very positive. The fight card was received very positively after the changes were made. So that's kind of where all this conspiracy theory talk comes from. But before we get into anything else, I am going to play the clip for you of Dana White. He's saying in this clip, you know, he heard Pat Miletich is, you know, saying these conspiracy theories regarding UFC 279 and basically what he thinks of it. I'm going to play that clip for you right now.
If you think that we told Khamzat Chimaev to not make weight, then Khamzat shows up and the fans are all pissed off at him and stuff. And he's going to just, I mean, and knowing, if you know anything about the sport, this is a guy that was actually in the sport, training and fighting and everything else. If Pat really said that, it's fucking, holy shit. We might have to send him out to the fucking clinic here, the brain clinic, get him fucking checked out. All right, buddy. Done with me?
I believe that was Brendan Schaub who said that.
It was what?
Brendan Schaub who made up that conspiracy.
Oh, it wasn't Pat Miletich?
I think so.
Well, I apologize to Pat Miletich then. That makes sense. Bye.
So there you hear it from Dana White saying, you know what, if, you know, Pat Miletich really said this, you know, we need to get his brain checked out. Essentially what he's saying is Pat Miletich has brain damage. He has CTE, and that there's no way conceivable that the UFC intentionally orchestrated this whole shift around to the UFC 279 pay-per-view. And there was some more to this clip, you know, calling name calling and all that stuff like that from Dana White. I'm not going to play it all. But essentially he says this is ridiculous that anyone would even speculate about this idea. I don't think it's ridiculous to speculate about it. But then an MMA media member, I'm not sure who it was, says, I believe that was Brendan Schaub. And Dana White says, oh, well, then I apologize to Pat Miletich. That makes sense. But Dana White never directly went after Brendan Schaub. But I guess, you know, after the fact that he said, oh, well, that was Brendan Schaub. And then I guess you could apply the earlier comments to Brendan Schaub. But Dana White was going after Pat Miletich, and rightfully so. We're going to play the clip for you here in a second. But this is kind of where the whole story began, because Dana White was going off about it because all these people have these conspiracy theories about UFC 279, and he was right about Pat Miletich, but for some reason that MMA media member was confused or whatever, and so then you end up getting the headline, basically, that Dana White takes a shot at Brendan Schaub. That ended up being the report. The exact headline was Dana White blast effing stupid UFC 279 conspiracy theory, takes shots at Brendan Schaub. And I'm assuming Brendan Schaub just saw this. They probably didn't play it, write the article completely in context. And regardless, the person said, oh, it was Brendan Schaub. And he said, oh, well, that makes sense at the end. But in the beginning, he was going after Pat Miletich. Well, anyway, Brendan Schaub posts this long Instagram post, and I'm going to go through it line by line because I find some of this interesting. I find some of it hilarious. And there's some points in here from Brendan Schaub that are very valid about Dana White, and I'm going to explain some of these points. So he says, oh God, here we go again. I've been nothing but cool and thought you'd learn from the last time you mentioned my name and got destroyed. They got into an argument, I think like a year or two ago, where Dana White and Brendan Schaub were going back and forth. That's irrelevant. Unfortunately, not surprised. You are a bully. Always have been. You put on a pair of designer jeans and some hip sneakers and think you're cool. I thought that line was absolutely hilarious. While that is true about Dana White, that also describes Brendan Schaub to a T. So I just thought it was hilarious that he said that. You're still a dork with a frat bro vocabulary, calling me and numerous people dummy, dumbass, fucking idiot, because we have questions about the chaos at UFC 279. I mean, that describes him as well, but that also describes Dana White, so fair enough. Also, no one is talking about gate tickets. What that refers to is people were, Dana said people were speculating they shifted around the card because of ticket sales or whatever. And Dana said the card was sold out, before this happened and nobody asked for refunds because the main event got changed. They have to offer refunds, but nobody asked for a refund even once the card was, shifted around. But basically Dana's saying, this event was sold out. Why would we shift it around for gate tickets? But then we get more clarity from Brendan Schaub later, because I actually couldn't find what exactly, the media member was talking about. I found some from Brendan Schaub, but nothing of him pointing out anything explicitly about UFC 279. But basically Dana's saying it was already sold out. I was referring to pay-per-view buys and how UFC 279 was trending, which you don't release to the public, but will say, it went fucking great, bros. Sorry, we just don't buy what you're telling us after lying numerous times, but the sheep media you pick to attend events don't have the balls to call you out. So what's funny about this is essentially what Brendan Schaub now, I could not find any evidence. I found some evidence of him speculating on it, but never explicitly saying, he believes this or he thinks this actually happened. But essentially what Brendan's saying in this comment or this message here is that Dana White in the UFC could have potentially shifted around the event because pay-per-view buys weren't doing well. Now, when they say an event is trending, they're talking about the numbers on social media. And while that could be true, maybe it wasn't trending well, I find that hard to believe. The embeddeds were doing very well. And also on top of that, who's buying the pay-per-view 2 days in advance? If you buy the pay-per-view that early, let me know down in the comments, because I usually buy like the afternoon, the day of, just to make sure I don't have any problems later on. I don't want to wait till the exact time the pay-per-view is going to start. I don't think anyone's buying pay-per-views 48 hours beforehand, because what could happen and the event could fall out and all this and that. So I find that kind of strange. I find that hard to believe that, because of the trending numbers aren't doing well, good enough on YouTube and Instagram based on their content they're putting out, which they were doing well from what I saw, that the UFC was going to shift around. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. But one thing I did see in here, and people might not understand if you don't follow the sport close enough, when Brendan Schaub said, sorry, we don't just buy what you're telling us after lying numerous times, but the sheep media you pick to attend events don't have the balls to call you out. What that means is the MMA media that attends the press conference, if you're ever wondering why they don't push back on Dana White, why they don't ask really, really hard questions or tough questions to Dana White, is because the UFC has been known in the past, when they don't like a media member, they ban them from the events. You remember Ariel Helwani years ago when he broke the news he wasn't supposed to break? That's a little bit of a different scenario, but they banned him and then they unbanned him. But they've been known in the past, if you're hard on the UFC, if you give them any negative press, they will ban you from coming to their events, from their press conferences, and effectively end your career depending on, if your career relies explicitly on covering live events, that ends your career being banned from there. So that's what he's referring to. So that's why a lot of the media members don't push back on Dana about anything ever. So then he says, just in the recent press conference, you were caught lying about extra compensation to the fighters. What Brendan is talking about here, and this is also very, very true, is Dana was asked, how much did it cost? Basically, how much extra money did you have to give to the fighters to keep this event on at UFC 279? Because he basically had to renegotiate fights for 6 different fighters, Imagine being Kevin Holland, you got to fight Khamzat Chimaev now instead of Daniel Rodriguez. And Dana White said, these guys all have deals. And he was basically saying, we didn't pay them any extra. That is a flat-out lie. Brendan Schaub is 100% right about that. There is no way all 6 of these guys are taking new fights on 24 hours notice without getting some type of assurances and bonuses from the UFC, extra pay from the UFC. There's no way. Because essentially, if these fighters decide, we're not fighting. Okay, one of them maybe, but, it just throws the whole event out of whack. And if all of them, then the card's canceled and the UFC loses out on money and has to cancel the entire event, refund everyone's tickets. It's a massive debacle. So he's 100% right about this. The UFC paid those fighters more money. I don't know how much, but he paid them more. He just didn't want that known. He didn't want to put that out there, and that's why he denied it. Then he goes on to say, you need a reality check. You're surrounded by yes men. You're not special. You're not original. You're a low-budget Vince McMahon. Maybe so. Maybe so. Every move you make is a copycat of that dude. Only thing you have in common is you're both on steroids and dress like assholes. Dana White's definitely on steroids or TRT. That's 100% accurate. We pretty much know that. I think he's come out and even said, he's on certain things, but that's irrelevant to the whole thing. Need I remind you, your origin story is a failed cardio kickboxing instructor who had 2 rich friends in high school to fund this business. Now go make a cool video with the Nelk Boys to stay relevant, or have your PR team come up with a good press story to distract the fans away from the fighters' pay and how they have to wear those awful Under Armour rock shoes and won't see a dime, dummy. P.S. Quit stealing my shows on Thick Boy Network and recreating it on Fight Pass, okay? Also, leave Pat Miletich alone. And we're going to talk about Pat Miletich here in a second. So this last whole paragraph is hilariously funny and partially true. So first off, as far as the origin story about him being a failed boxing cardio, kickboxing trainer or boxing trainer, whatever you want to call it, I don't get why that really is relevant. I guess he's just trying to put down Dana White. But it's just, it's kind of interesting that he says, if you didn't have these 2 rich friends basically to make you, you would be nothing. That's essentially what Brendan Schaub is saying there. And I find that pretty hilarious. And I know there's some people that are going to disagree with me on this. Brendan Schaub would not exist, I believe, without the help of his good friend Joe Rogan. And specifically being on his podcast and that, that viral clip that went around after Brendan Schaub was getting brutally KO'd in the UFC. And Joe Rogan asked him, how do you think you would do against Cain Velasquez? And he said, you'd be surprised. And Joe Rogan said to him, I think you'd be surprised because he'd fuck you up. And that went viral. And then Brendan Schaub, kind of took the comments to heart and then ended up starting podcasts and doing this and that. And Joe Rogan has a very popular platform. And maybe Brendan Schaub would have made it on his own. I'm sure he would have had some success, but he would have nowhere near the amount of success he has now without Rogan. But that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you get help from someone. It doesn't matter. But so I don't know why he's calling out Dana for, if you didn't have these 2 rich friends, I get he's in this. He wants to put Dana White down, and, Dana's probably put him down and said, without Rogan, you'd be nothing. I'm sure he did. But these are just weird comments. And then he says, now go make a cool video with the Nelk Boys to stay relevant. That's not for Dana White to stay relevant. I've talked about the Nelk Boys and the UFC's relationship before on live streams. The UFC and the Nelk Boys have the same target demographic. Dana White uses the Nelk Boys as a promotional tool to promote the UFC. That's exactly what he does. There's a reason Dana White's name is constantly in the headlines. There's a reason Brendan Schaub is talking about him. I mean, obviously, in this point, he has a right to. There's a reason thou who shall not be named, the YouTube boxer, is always mentioning Dana. There's a reason, Dana, has his faults and is always making up lies. And I love Dana White slander to begin with. I love it just as much as the next guy. But I'm just going through this piece by piece and giving you guys my take on all of it. But there's a reason everyone's always talking about Dana. It's because he's always relevant, and he will be in the combat sports community. And then he goes on to say, and have your PR team come up with a good press story to distract the fans away from fighter pay and how they have to wear those awful Under Armour rock shoes that they won't see a dime of. That is absolutely hilarious. Those shoes are awful. Nate Diaz called it out in a clip that got posted around, that got edited out of his interview with Megan O'Leary on the UFC 279 pre-fight. And I thought it was hilarious because those shoes are corny as hell, and the fighters aren't getting paid any more for wearing them. So he's 100% correct on this. I don't think the UFC is going to come up with some story to distract from this. They don't care. They don't care that much. And then he says, leave Pat Miletich alone. We're going to bring Pat Miletich in this in a second. But you have Brendan Schaub, his total comments. Some of the things are super accurate. Basically, he just wanted to fire back, and he wanted to put Dana down in some way, shape, or form. And he got some good, remarks in here. And I'm sure Dana will probably see these and be asked about it in the next press conference. Then we'll get some more back and forth. But Brendan Schaub, absolutely correct about the fighter pay, about the dumb shoes, about the, MMA media, the ones they hand select to attend events. All of that was correct. But the main thing I took from this is what Brendan Schaub's thoughts were. And essentially what they were the UFC shifted around this event so they could increase pay-per-view sales. And we're going to get to that towards the end of the video. I want to talk about now what Pat Miletich said, because I don't believe it was Brendan Schaub who was the catalyst for all this conspiracy theory talk. A lot of people were speculating about this. I have a video on it where I talk about it a little bit the day before UFC 279. I'll link that down in the description. A lot of people were speculating about this because the card was shifting around, and then we got, pretty much 100% positivity, around the card after it got shifted around, which you never see. The MMA community cannot agree on anything. And it was universally loved that this card got shifted around. So I understand why people are a little bit weird saying, okay, maybe this was shifted around purposely. But now we're going to play Pat Miletich's, thoughts. He posted this on an Instagram video, I believe it was. And I'm going to play that recording for you right now, and then we're going to react to it.
Guy that's wrestled his whole life, a guy from Chechnya, nonetheless, missed weight by 7.5 pounds. That certainly wasn't by accident. I'm pretty sure that the card was not selling well on pay-per-view, and they told him, miss weight big so we can put you against Holland, because this thing's not selling and we got to shake things up and cause a scene and get some attention on this card.
So there you hear it from Pat Miletich. Essentially, he's saying the same thing that Brendan Schaub alluded to in his, Instagram post, that the UFC asked Khamzat Chimaev to miss weight so they could shuffle around the card. And we're going to talk about the validity of this in a minute, but Pat Miletich is the one that said this. This is, where he came out and just straight up said it. Like, he didn't allude to it. He didn't beat around the bush. He flat out said somebody told Khamzat Chimaev to miss weight. And whether you believe that or not, the original Dana White comments were directly related to that video, I believe. And then for whatever reason, that MMA media member shifted it on Brendan Schaub, who talked about it a little bit from my understanding and, alluded to it a little bit. I couldn't find any, definitive clips of Brendan Schaub saying it. But I couldn't go through and watch his entire podcast. I mean, I'd rather jump in a wood chipper than listen to Brendan Schaub's entire podcast. But I'm not a fan of Brendan Schaub. I'm not a fan of Dana White. I'm not taking sides here. I'm just kind of, going through all this. But what Dana White said originally about not Brendan Schaub, about Pat Miletich is, what should have been said. It should have been left at that, because it wasn't Brendan Schaub that was doing this. So Dana was completely wrong. But it's not really his fault, because he didn't even come out and directly say Brendan Schaub. He didn't mess it up. It was the MMA media member that messed it up. So as far as the actual conspiracy, so there's so many layers to this conspiracy. And essentially it revolves around the pre-fight press conference getting canceled. That's one of the first things. Like, oh, why did it get canceled? First off, the pre-fight presser, I mean, what does that even... I don't even understand people referencing that in terms of, the whole conspiracy of the fight card getting changed around. I made a video immediately after the presser was canceled, and I told you guys the truth about the press conference was essentially what happened, and I still stand by this. We have more evidence to support this theory now. You can go back and watch that video on the channel. I'll link it down in the description as well, my immediate reaction. You had grown men yelling at each other. You had grown men throwing water bottles. And essentially you have 3, 4 loose cannons, crazy fighters behind the scenes, and you don't have enough security because they got their whole entourage with them. So the UFC decided, okay, it's already getting heated in the back here. Nothing's really happened yet, but we're going to cancel the presser because we don't need the presser to sell this card. We're going to cancel it and not risk, a Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz scenario from years ago where they were throwing the Monster energy drinks and the water bottles and stuff like that. That is the reason the UFC canceled that pre-fight presser. I don't believe there's anything more to that, and nothing really happened. It got over-sensationalized by the MMA media, and they made it out to be this brawl. I'm telling you guys, I literally did a video maybe 2 hours after this happened, and I told you guys, it was nothing but them shouting at each other and throwing water bottles, and nothing actually happened. And it just got canceled, and then people started calling it a brawl for no apparent reason. I mean, we've seen some footage of it, and it's literally nothing. And, it's one of those things where, the UFC just made a decision to not risk anything actually happening and fights getting canceled. Now, as far as, the Khamzat Chimaev theory that he missed weight intentionally, I have a couple theories beyond that. First off, this fight was announced on 6 weeks notice. Usually a fighter's giving 8 to 10 weeks. Khamzat said he was a little bit bigger when he accepted the fight, so that could be a theory for why he missed weight. But I think there's a high probability he came into this fight with a minor injury. I believe the UFC knew about this minor injury a couple weeks ago. I think they knew. I think they probably put Kevin Holland, Daniel Rodriguez, as well as, Li Jingliang and Tony Ferguson on this card because of this injury, and they were hoping to still have a card. They could at least convert it to a fight night or something. Because before they added those 2 fights, 3 weeks out and 2 weeks out, if the main event fell out, this wasn't even a fight night card. So I think they knew about this injury. Khamzat said, you know what, I can still make weight. Khamzat apparently showed up. He was pretty close to weight. He cut weight from the information that's come out so far. He cut weight down to 174, 175, and then his body started to lock up. And under the advice of the doctors, they quit the weight cut because essentially I think it was kind of a group decision. If we stop the weight cut here, we can still keep him on the card rather than remove him from the card altogether. And then a fight gets canceled. One of the top 3 fights get canceled if Khamzat Chimaev pulls out. So they made that decision. He ends up fighting Kevin Holland. And people are saying that, okay, he missed the weight intentionally. UFC conspired with him to miss the weight so that, they could rearrange the card because of pay-per-view sales. First of all, I go back to my point from earlier. Who's buying pay-per-views 2 days in advance? Because they knew Friday morning, so that's almost 48 hours. I mean, I know that's a little bit, it's maybe 40 hours before the event. No one's buying the pay-per-views then. The embedded numbers were high. The countdown numbers were pretty high. The interviews were doing pretty high. The pre-fight scrums were doing pretty high. But again, that's just metrics. That doesn't always translate to buys. But at the end of the day, ESPN is the one that makes the money from the pay-per-views, okay? And I'll tell you this right now, no matter how bad Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz was trending, which literally is basically meaningless, I guarantee Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz was probably going to be the biggest pay-per-view of this year. I honestly believe that. I would be pretty confident in that assessment. I would almost bet my house on it. That if this fight had went through, I think this would have been the highest selling pay-per-view of the year. That's crazy to say, but the pay-per-view numbers haven't been doing pretty great from what we've been hearing. And Dana White isn't out there bragging about it. And I know we don't get the public numbers released. So, it's one of those things. Now, did the fight card turn out better? Yes. The fight card turned out better on paper, but not for the UFC. And also, again, ESPN gets all the pay-per-view money and they pay the UFC a flat rate. That's how it works. So the UFC doesn't get any of the pay-per-view money. They have a deal with ESPN Plus. ESPN Plus pays them a flat rate for the year. UFC guarantees them X amount of events, and ESPN takes all the pay-per-view profits. That's how it works. So it really doesn't make sense when, regardless of how this fight card was trending, I believe it would be the top pay-per-view of the year, that they're going to shuffle around the card just because it wasn't trending that well. I just find that hard to believe. And then on top of that, I believe the UFC and Dana White had one goal with UFC 279, Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz. They had one goal. And if you watch my channel, you've heard me talk about it for literal months. Their one goal was to devalue Nate Diaz as much as possible because he refused to sign a contract extension. They wanted Khamzat Chimaev to absolutely demolish him and devalue him on his way to the free market and to become a free agent. That's their goal. I believe Dana White would sacrifice 10, 20, 30 million dollars to achieve that goal. And I don't believe he was going to sacrifice. I don't think he was going to have to sacrifice if the Khamzat Chimaev Nate Diaz main event went through. People would have bought that. And basically Pat Miletich alluded to, later in the video, I didn't play the whole video for you, that essentially people weren't going to buy it because they didn't think Nate Diaz versus Khamzat Chimaev was going to be competitive. Us hardcore fans know that, but the casual fans who love Nate Diaz, and I love Nate Diaz too. I'm not saying hardcore fans don't love Nate Diaz. But the vast majority of the pay-per-view buys were going to come from casual fans who love Nate Diaz. The casual fans thought that Nate Diaz had a chance to beat Khamzat Chimaev. I'll tell you that much right now. So it's just a terrible conspiracy theory. And the UFC ends up, any money they maybe gain for, because if anything, they earn pay-per-views not from switching the card around, but from all the attention they got from switching the card around. Maybe more people heard about the card, so they end up buying it. But it's not going to be a significant amount where the money they pay out to all 6 fighters to cover them taking a different fight on short notice, it's going to counteract any extra pay-per-view money they make. And then you have to factor in all the different editing they had to pay. I felt bad for the editors on 24 hours notice. They had to come up with different packages now for 3 different fights, the 3 top fights. They had to now put video packages and graphic packages together for those fights instead. So at bare minimum, the extra pay-per-view sales that they would have because of the attention they got on the card would probably be canceled out by paying the fighters extra and all this, extra fees with the editing and the graphics and all that stuff on 24 hours notice. Not to mention, again, it goes against the main goal of the UFC, which is to devalue Nate Diaz and watch Nate Diaz get brutally smashed by Khamzat Chimaev. So I think people were giving the UFC too much credit. They're acting like the UFC is too smart and that they concocted this whole plan and they did it on 24 hours notice. And also, if the UFC wanted to switch the card around, they could have switched it around a week before. It wouldn't matter. People would be like, oh, this card's great. They didn't have to have Khamzat miss weight to switch around the card. And one more thing before I go. In the clip with Dana White, he did say something that I wanted to point out. I didn't play this part in the clip that I showed you, but he said, we're regulated by the Athletic Commission. That made me raise my eyebrows a bit because in the past, every time Dana White says that, he's using that as a cop-out for something he should be doing. So I thought that was interesting because people used to criticize the UFC for not having stringent enough drug testing and PED testing. And Dana used to always say, we're regulated by the Athletic Commission. Meanwhile, the Athletic Commission was only testing guys the day of the fights. You had to be a complete idiot to get caught using PEDs when they were doing that type of testing. Eventually, the pressure with Vitor Belfort and some of these other guys who were looking absolute crazy jacked, ended up, putting the pressure on the UFC with the media, with the fans, and they ended up, hiring USADA and getting the USADA program. But I just thought it was so funny. Dana, said, we're regulated by the commission, because that is a total cop-out. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Do any of you guys think that the UFC intentionally did this? They had Khamzat Chimaev. It just doesn't add up to me. Like, they had Khamzat Chimaev intentionally miss weight when they could have just said, you know what, Khamzat? A couple days before, we're going to switch your fight around. You can fight Kevin Holland now or Daniel Rodriguez, and we can shuffle the card around because it's not doing well. They could have easily done that on Tuesday. It wouldn't make sense. It would not make sense to wait till 24 hours beforehand to throw this fight card together. It was a terrible fight card. It's all the UFC's fault for, to begin with, that they had to swap all these fights around because the card was terrible. Without Khamzat Chimaev on the card, that was an absolute shit stain of a pay-per-view without Khamzat on it. Even with Khamzat on it, it was, I rated it, a 3 out of 10 when I graded the pay-per-view a couple weeks before the event. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.